Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Sure, I just wanted to welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Newberger, and I am a professor in the Department of History here at UT Austin, and also the director of our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. My co-host is Kirill.
Thank you very much, Mary. My name, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Kirill Avramov. I'm assistant professor of political science, but I do belong to the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And today I'm extremely happy to have a very interesting person, friend, a personality that wears multiple hats in a good sense. And is doing a lot of good work. And this is Angela Rodel, who is a literary translator from Bulgarian into English, who holds degrees from Yale and UCLA. Her translations have appeared in McSweeney's, Tulane's, Ploughshares, Words Without Borders, and elsewhere. She has received an NEA and PEN translation grants. 7 novels in her translation have been published in the US and the UK, and her translation of Georgi Gospodinov's Physics of Sorrow won the 2016 AATSEEL Prize for Literary Translation, as well as an NEA Translation grant. Her translation of Gospodinov's novel Time Shelter, Времяубежище in Bulgarian, was featured in the New Yorker's list of best books in 2022, and most importantly, won in 2023 the International Booker Prize, something unprecedented for Bulgarian literature. Since 2015, she has served as the executive director of the Bulgarian-American Fulbright Commission, and this is only a fraction that I know what Angela is doing in Sofia in Bulgaria. Probably later, she can tell us also about, she's been very modest here about her musical accomplishments as well. Angela, добре дошла на Balkan Circle.
Благодаря. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with my esteemed colleagues. And I just wanted to ask about the format. Is it, I have something prepared, but how long? Because I want to have lots of times for question, discussion, and back and forth with you all. So how does your format usually run?
We would like to have, the one that you have prepared to start for the discussion. Usually, it's about, we give our guests for around 35 to 40 minutes, to talk about their work and, present the most important things. And then we open for discussion and questions from the audience.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Kirill and Mary and everyone for joining this evening. It is a great honor to be with you. And indeed, as Kirill mentioned, I am a literary translator from Bulgarian. I did my undergraduate at Yale in their Slavic department, studied Russian, and then fell in love with Bulgarian folk music. And gradually shifted my focus and ended up doing graduate work at UCLA in ethnomusicology and linguistics. And then I've been in Bulgaria full-time for almost 20 years. And for the last 8 of them, I've been at the Fulbright Commission. So I hope there's colleagues that might be interested in Fulbright. We can also talk about that. Great opportunity for everyone interested in language, culture, history, poli-sci. So I have prepared a little presentation. I thought today I would talk about the sort of behind the scenes in the kitchen of literary translation, because I think translating from a small language, and I'm sure a lot of colleagues here probably do translate from various languages. There's 7 million speakers of Bulgarian in the world, so it counts as a small language. Has its challenges, as Kirill mentioned, trying to get the attention of the English-speaking world. And so I've adapted an article that I had written just to kind of talk about maybe more the practical aspects of how one becomes a translator, what that means, how that looks at times, and what the opportunities and challenges are. So I have called it Factotum and Fakir, and we'll talk about what those things mean in the Bulgarian context, the translator of Bulgarian literature into English. And if people have questions and comments, I think we can, open up or you feel free to type them in the chat or jump in. So I think thanks to Bukowski, we all immediately have a mental image of Factotum, this jack of all trades, the perennial handyman, maybe like a scut worker. And I think a lot of translators from smaller languages and literatures can perhaps see themselves in this role, but with a little less booze and sexual shenanigans maybe than the Bukowski version. But the Oxford English, so I think Factotum is more or less clear. You know, you're sort of the jack of all trades. But in terms of fakir, what does the word fakir mean? The Oxford English Dictionary defines fakir as a religious ascetic who lives solely on alms. This is most likely borrowed by the British in colonial India. And I believe many translators can also identify with this archetype. I think we are literary monastics of a sort. We tend to be very idealistic, perhaps fanatical in our dedication to our craft. And certainly none of us are in the business to get rich. And I love to quote my colleague, the Mexican writer and translator from Bulgarian, Reynal Vasquez, who put it very eloquently, quote, "There are many sophisticated ways of starving yourself to death, and being a translator from Bulgarian is one of them," end quote. But the interesting thing is that in Bulgarian, we also have the word fakir because it was part of the Ottoman Empire for 500 years. So it appears to have been borrowed. It's an Arabic word that originally means poor, but it came into Bulgarian through Turkish. And those of you who know Bulgarian and other Balkan Slavic languages, I'm sure you're familiar that many colorful Turkishisms have been borrowed into Slavic languages and undergo some interesting semantic shifts. So in Bulgarian, actually, a fakir, it can mean something like the religious ascetic, but it more often means something, I put this in Bulgarian, but I'll read it for you. So fakir can mean somebody who's like a magician, who does like sleight of hand tricks. But in more colloquial speech, it can also mean a very handy person who's very skilled and clever at doing things. So I like this. I think this fits pretty well for translators because I think that we are fakirs in this Bulgarian sense. If we're really good at what we do, we're able to pull literary works out of one culture into another, sort of like a coin from behind the ear, like a magician. And if we're good enough, you won't even notice us doing it. So what I'm thinking today I can talk about is some of the challenges of this sleight of hand of bringing a small literature like Bulgarian to English. And due to the size and influence of the English language, and particularly of the US market, translated literature is often, I would say, disregarded or takes a very minor role. But I think in the past 10 years, we've seen this changing, and especially for Bulgarian authors, since the Booker, I think we're slipping through some cracks in the citadel, and we're using some new opportunities to decenter the literary industry and actually having a cornerstone writer like Georgi Gospodinov, who now with Time Shelter has really kind of broken through this glass ceiling. I am hopeful that we'll see more Bulgarian works and authors becoming visible. But let's talk about the path to making that happen. This year. So what I'm talking about today is in a wonderful volume called Bulgarian Literature as World Literature that was edited by Michaela Harper and Dmitry Komburov. It's probably in the UT Austin library. So if anybody's interested, they can look that up. And the other articles in there also talk about Bulgarian literature. So what are some of the primary challenges for translating a local literature into the global literary lingua franca? So when we talk about the peculiarities of the English language market, I love to quote Chad Post, who's the editor-in-chief of Open Letter Press at the University of Rochester. It's one of the few presses in the US that focus exclusively on literature and translation, and he has vehemently called attention to what he terms the 3% problem, which namely is the fact that only 3% of all books translated in the United States are in translation. And he lays out the reasons for this and sums up this dismal situation quite succinctly saying, quote, translators definitely aren't valued by the marketplace. And if they aren't protected in university, they're pretty much screwed, end of quote. But I think against this generally discouraging backdrop, the Bulgarian case until recently has looked, I would say, even more grim. There was a really great study that came out here by an NGO called the Next Page Foundation. It's Prevod and Prehod, which is translation and transition. This means, of course, the transition after communism. And they have a database of, post 1989, And according to their calculation, something slightly more than 50 Bulgarian works have been translated into Bulgarian in that period since 1989. So I think Bulgarian literature doesn't have a 3% problem, but something like a 0.3% problem. So I think what we can take away from Chad's analysis is that it really is a buyer's market. Like, the publishers definitely hold the power, and thus translators need to use our fakiresque skills in order to woo the publisher to see a book to translation. So that means we need to put to work many aspects of our skill set. We need to be scouts, we need to be grant writers, we need to be editors, and possibly even cyborg editors now with AI on the scene, consultants, agents, marketers, cultural ambassadors. So we really are, I think, what could be called dominus factotum, playing all these roles. So in terms of scouting, this is one of the things I love the most about actually being a literary translator, is that we sort of are on the front lines of looking for the interesting new voices that are arising in a literary scene, in a context. And we are pretty much talent scouts. And smaller languages, we don't usually get publishers coming to us and saying, hey, what's the what's new on the Bulgarian literary scene? And we also can't impress publishers with best-selling statistics, because in a small market, a bestseller in Bulgaria is a few thousand copies, and that's not going to impress a typical, foreign language publisher. So I think how we can sell our authors is by finding really interesting voices like Georgi Gospodinov, people that are doing something outside of the status quo, that are using new literary models and new literary approaches. That is what's going to catch the attention of UK and US publishers. This is hard. I mean, what my good friend and journalist Dmitry Kenarov, Bulgaria was perhaps even more disadvantaged in this respect, because when communism fell in 1989, there was I think a rush of interest in literature from Eastern Europe, and the sort of standard genre is the novel in the international literary scene. It's the easiest thing to pitch. It's the easiest thing to sell. And Bulgaria's strength in the 20th century was not really in the novel. It was more in short stories and poetry. Of course, there were some great novels, and Wolf Hunt here is one of them. But what was really happening in Bulgaria in the 1990s in terms of interesting, edgy literature was poetry. The Bulgarian poetry scene was incredible in the 1990s. And actually, Georgi Gospodinov was a very crucial member of that scene. But we didn't have that Milan Kundera, we didn't have the Ivo Andrić to say this is the novel of the Bulgarian transition or the novel of the Bulgarian socialist experience. And so Bulgaria really did kind of remain a terra incognita, I think, for Eastern European literature for much of the 2000s. So this I think puts us in an especially important role as translators, because we're the ones who can say, okay, this is the interesting thing that's happening on the scene. And just to kind of illustrate this, I think Wolf Hunt is I don't know if anybody's here has read it, but it's a really incredible novel about basically the nationalization of agriculture in a small village in northeastern Bulgaria. It doesn't sound like a page turner, but it's absolutely gorgeous. It's written about 6 guys in a village, and it's a really interesting psychological portrait. Some of them are pro-communist, some of them are anti-communist, but it was written in the 80s, and I love this novel, and it really took about 6 or 7 years of very, I would say, insistent effort to pitch this. And finally, Archipelago, which is a wonderful niche publisher in New York, picked this volume up. But it's very difficult in terms of classics as well, because when the author is deceased, as unfortunately Ivailo Petrov is, this also makes marketing more difficult. You can't trot out the author to book fairs and book launches, and so the scouting is a careful calculation. You have to balance between your own passion and excitement about a project, but also thinking about the work's saleability and palatability, I think, to US publishers. And so we have to keep our eye on both sides. We have to see what the trends are in the US translation market, what kinds of books, what kinds of voices, what kinds of novels are resonating with US audiences, but then also what do we have that's interesting here in Bulgaria? Of course, grant writers, everyone here is in academia. You all know this about grant writing. So literary translation, to state the obvious, is not a particularly lucrative business. Most published translations, I mean, if we're putting aside, Paulo Coelho and Stieg Larsson, don't usually cover the costs of the work through sales. They're usually made possible by grants from government institutions or private foundations. So, I mean, of course, things like PEN, like NEA are very important, but most countries have a policy and support for their own literary production. In Bulgaria, we are seeing this change. We're seeing more attention being paid to the importance of having a presence at the Frankfurt Book Fair, for example. There are a few programs in Bulgaria to support translations abroad, but they're not nearly as robust as most of the other countries in the European Union, and there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. So I think we're still waiting for developments to have a more accessible national translation funding program. That's something those of us who work here are lobbying for. We just last night there was the awards from the National Book Center's Quill Center, and the Minister of Culture was there, and there were quite a few appeals to him, and it's great that he was there and was listening to precisely on this topic, that we would like to see a more robust support, because it really is the way to get these voices out, because there's not, except in very unusual circumstances, the commercial potential is not what's going to inspire publishers necessarily to take a risk on a book that they're not familiar with. So the translator as editor. So I put Godzilla here, and the reason I put Godzilla here is I actually loved this quote from, there's a wonderful Bulgarian author, Miroslav Penkov, who actually lives in Dallas, Texas. I'm not sure if you guys have come across him. He's a terrific writer. He teaches creative writing. Anyway, he had been writing in Bulgarian, and then he moved to the US and started writing in English. And he had been published in Bulgaria, but when he finally got a terrific deal with FSG, which is a great, very well-known publisher here, he told this story when he came back to Bulgaria. He said the first pass with his editor was a sech, which means like bloodbath in Bulgarian. And I think this, him having been a writer working in both contexts brings to the fore that there isn't really Anglo-Saxon style developmental editing so much in Bulgaria. We're starting to see more. Sophia University has a creative writing program. The wonderful Elizabeth Kostova Foundation is starting to do craft seminars, for writers to get into this idea of, craft. But in most Bulgarian works, you'll see an editor listed in them, but I think oftentimes this role is more akin to like a copy editor or collegial coaching, and it's nowhere near as all-encompassing as a professional content editor that we would find at a US publishing house. So this can make the job of the translator somewhat delicate, because really sometimes you are the first person who's really stuck their hands in the guts of the work, like Godzilla, sort of, tearing it apart and saying, okay, if we want to be, we want this work to absolutely resonate with the audience, the English language audience, we need to, there's always a contextual translation, but this can be sometimes a shock and a really somewhat painful experience for the author. And I think there is a little bit of romanticism in terms of the way the creative process works here, which is fine. I do often work with authors that are not comfortable with a sort of more active editing style, in the sense that, this was the way the work came to them, which is fine. When I meet that, I'm like, that's great, you're the author. But it can make it difficult in order to navigate that relationship. Okay, I want this book to be as successful as possible in the English language contest, which might mean a little bit of stealth glossing. It might mean a little bit of tweaking. It might mean adding context, removing some things. And I think this is where we have to be fakirs as well. We want to, gently cajole the author into making sure that we have this, they see this work with us as a creative collaboration and not Godzilla coming and vivisecting their work. So it can be a delicate moment. And then, of course, as those of you who are linguists here, and I hope that I have of fellow linguists among us, I think those of us who work in between languages, we know that there are purely structural differences between languages that often require a more deliberate strategy. And those of you who work with Slavic, I'm sure will recognize some of these. I love Roman Jakobsen, and I make my students read him, and they usually aren't very happy. And at the end, they're happy. But I love his work, and he has a great quote that says, languages differ essentially in what they must convey, not in what they may convey. So there's usually always a workaround, but sometimes there are linguistic categories like gender, like number, like certain types of tenses that must be coded in one language or the other. And then how are we going to find ways to represent those differences in the target language? So one thing I come across a lot in Bulgarian is the literary stylistic tradition has developed such that playing with tense, changing tense, in English, generally, it's seen as a bit sloppy for an author to be switching tenses. And we use it very specifically as a stylistic device. Like you read like Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, you'll see like when there's a tense change, it is meant to heighten tension or to reduce distance between the reader and the text. Whereas in Bulgarian, I think that the cultural tradition is such that you're showing mastery and skill by being playful with the tenses and moving back and forth between them. So it's not a value judgment. Both traditions are equally valued, but it makes it very difficult because when you're the translator, if you do a one-to-one translation, it can be distracting to the English reader or seem like sloppy work on the side of the translator, just because we don't have this cultural understanding of this playfulness with tenses. And so I love this. This is an example. I'm sure Kiro had to read it in school by Petko Slovakov, who is a classic Bulgarian, one of the grandfathers of the Bulgarian canon. And you see here, I mean, he's basically starts out in present tense, Gergana voda naliva, belisi kraka izmiva, present, Vizir prečedr sedеше, gledal Gergana čudil se. So we have past imperfect, and then we have this past evidential form. So he really is sort of playing between tenses. Whereas, in this to a Bulgarian, is a plus, whereas in English, my colleague Chris Buxton, you can see in his translation, has decided to go for the simple past. And I think that's a lot of the types of things that we have to think about when we're quote unquote editing or translating structural types of elements from one language to another. And that's a conversation that I think we need to have with authors. I don't think we should do it without informing them, but talk about, okay, this is the type of experience an English reader might have. These would be the advantages, these would be the disadvantages. And there's many things. Tense is just one, but I think honorifics are a thing that we often find challenging because we don't really have this very strict sense of honorifics in English. This witness, non-witness forms, preizказно наклонение, where if you saw actually firsthand the action happening, you say it one way. If not, you say it the other way. And it is a really great tool to be able to question the veracity of something. I rather wish we had it in English. I often talk to my students, I call it the yeah, right tense, because people can say, and they can use it to question. And we don't have that in English. So sometimes we have to find workarounds. Diminutive Slavic languages, wow, they're so easy to make and they're so effective. And I have some colleagues that are native speakers of Irish English, and they're like, oh, you can just we this, we that, the WEE, the little this, little that. But the native speaker of American English, it's not going to sound convincing in my translation. So that's oftentimes with Slavic language is a very challenge. Of course, English doesn't have gender for nouns, which is surprising how often this is played with in Bulgarian. You know, especially in poetry, but not only. Perfective, imperfective, we all know and love that, those of us who have studied Slavic languages. Evocative, a pro-drop, whereas, you know, Bulgarian doesn't have to write out subject pronouns, whereas English does. And it can, you know, Bulgarians can play with not having the pronoun there, whereas in English it sounds quite strange. So these are just some of these structural moments where we as translators need to work together with our authors. And of course, I mean, I think it's absolutely legitimate, and I'm seeing this more in translation, that that we can decide to leave the English reader uncomfortable. We can say, okay, the tenses are going to flip-flop. And this is something online, I'm in some literary translation groups, and especially those of us who translate from Slavic talk about, you know, this is the style, why should we cater to the English reader's expectations? So I think that's an ongoing conversation of how much we need to domesticate the structure of the language. And it's a delicate balance, because you want the reader to be engrossed in the story and not being like, this is a totally weird and bizarre translation. But on the other hand, you also don't want to be ironing out the things that give it the flavor of what makes the text Bulgarian. So I'd say that's an ongoing conversation. And you know, I think English, especially American English, linguistic hegemony is going to continue to be challenged, and rightly so. So stay tuned. So I think these are things are more on the linguistic level, but there are also a lot of translations that come on the cultural level. Socialist speak. How do you? There's this entire register of like socialist language, this sort of highfalutin. It doesn't really mean anything when you translate it literally, but the sounding of it is so culturally loaded, and so that is it's like meaningful in its meaninglessness. So you know, that's a difficult trope, and I often look to people who translate from Russian as well to see what kind of vocabulary they use to express this specific register that we find in some Eastern European literature, especially in Balkan literature, like the way Russian sounds to Bulgarian, or the way Serbian sounds to a Bulgarian or Turkish. It brings in an entire world of connotation that we don't have anything comparable in English. And so it's something that I always have to talk about with the author. Is this something that we should, try to save? And if so, how can we do that? And I think another thing that has been difficult for me as a translator, and I think something that a lot of us struggle with, is that there's different senses of what's politically correct or appropriate in a work of art, like a work of literature. And that's, a conversation that I have had with authors that I've worked with, and I know other translators have, because I think we can safely assume that most US publishing houses, at least, are pretty progressive, pretty liberal. And so there is this sense of certain types of language being inappropriate, even if they're used in a fictional way, like a character using an inappropriate slur or inappropriate language. This doesn't mean that the author is, defending this type of speech or this type of language, but I have often found myself grappling with how to translate these types of scenes that could be unacceptable or offensive in what's otherwise a really important work. And I don't want a publisher to dismiss them out of hand for those kinds of reasons, but also it's very difficult to talk to an author about why this, in this context, is not going to translate at all in the way that they have intended it to. And also, one thing that's interesting in Bulgaria, Christian themes are somewhat popular with certain authors, because during socialism, as we know, it was discourage this type of writing, and you know, people referring to Christian belief, Christian mysticism. And so in some contemporary, very good contemporary authors, this is an important theme for them, and using biblical references. But how that sounds to an American reader, where we have a very different context of, you know, religious fundamentalism, and it has a definite political, I would say, flavor to it here in our cultural understanding. And so it's an important conversation to have with authors. Just say, okay, this might be read in a certain way, and it's not going to sound dissident. It's not going to sound, it's not going to sound politically challenging. It's going to perhaps sound the opposite to an American reader who's coming from a very different context. And I think, again, we meet the question of cultural hegemony, and to what extent translators need to de-foreignize or tame or domesticate a text to make it palatable to English-speaking publishers and readers. I don't know. I mean, there are gatekeepers in the industry who have their own ideological preferences. And so I think we need to have that conversation. You know, I don't have an answer to this, but I think at least it's good to talk openly with the authors I work with, just to say, okay, we can insist that we keep the text the way that you've written it, but it may mean that we don't have access to a certain market or a certain publisher that we might otherwise have. So yeah, this idea of self-censorship or content editing is tricky for translators and for authors alike, because the English market is so dominant. And there is, I think, a pressure on writers to conform to American and English language expectations. So coming to the translator as editor, I'm sure all of you in academia are also tearing your hair out about ChatGPT and DeepL, and how are we all going to deal with this? They're very interesting. I think we live in interesting times. I have played around with translation programs. I think DeepL is the best. If I have to put my money on one of these, some things it does very well, other things not so well. It's not very good with register, uneven in terms of register. But I think it's a tool that I'm not sure we can bury our heads in the sand. But I think there is, at least at this point, a need for the human factor. At some point, we may become glorified editors. We'll see. It's an interesting open question. But I feel like, I mean, can you imagine 100 years ago when my predecessors as literary translators, you know, they didn't have Google, and you come across a cultural reference or a name, either you have to have an amazing, you know, encyclopedic knowledge of, you know, cultural history, or you got to go to the library and spend a week looking up how do you spell this name in, you know, Latin letters as opposed to Cyrillic, or vice versa. And, you know, clearly we use tools like Google. We use tools to see, there's really great tools online about, you know, when did a word come into use? When was it most commonly used? I think, you know, most translators have been using digital tools for years. I love thesaurus.com. I will admit, I you know, it's, you get in the semantic ballpark and then you kind of browse thesaurus. And so I think that we need to see this as a new tool and not necessarily as a, you know, end to our guild or our our work. But I think the structural problems also might be a challenge for some of these programs, like ProDrop. It does not do ProDrop well with the, you know, the lack of subject pronouns. So I think again, this is another ongoing conversation that we're going to be having. And even it was interesting when we were after the Booker Award, we had some interviews, and the Booker International Committee asked whether I would recommend the career of literary translation to young people. And I said, generally, yes, but I think these next couple of years are going to be very, I would say, very critical in terms of which direction the industry takes. You know, are we going to be more or less pushed into the role of glorified editors or not? We shall see. Okay, the translator as collaborator and consultant. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar as academics with this book that you probably had to read in grad school, just like I did, Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. I think especially working into a language like English, most writers that I've worked with, not all, but they often have a working grasp of English. Some even have a strong mastery, but they might not want to engage in self-translation, which I understand. Some people drive themselves crazy by going back and forth, and they're not sure which is the original, which is the translation at a certain point. So in general, I see this as a very positive thing. When I work with authors that have a good grasp of English, it opens up really incredible possibilities for collaboration and consultation, and it really enriches my process to be able to ask about nuance, to ask about preferences. But it also raises a question of, to what extent is the translator then still an author of the translation? I think traditionally we're seen as co-authors, but are we now, when we have an author that has quite a high mastery of the language that we're translating into, is our role more collaborator or consultant rather than author? And then also we get into this sticky question of, when do we have the right to insist on an interpretation? Or does the author's opinion always take precedent? And to what extent do we need to call in outside arbiters like editors, critics, readers, in these kinds of conversations that we're having with our authors? And I think it's really interesting, in The Death of the Author, Roland Barthes, he very much poo-poos this idea of authorial intentionalism. Like, it doesn't matter what the author meant, we need to liberate the text from interpretive tyranny. And are we as translators liberated from interpretive tyranny? I don't know. There's an ethical question here. If the author is alive and well and lives about 10 minutes away, is it ethical for me not to ask in such cases what they might have, how they would prefer this certain passage to be interpreted? So, I mean, in the workaday world of literary translation, which is far from the towering heights of French theory, I can confirm that actually authorial intentionalism is firmly entrenched. Most translators do believe that the author's intentions should at least inform the way that we interpret the text. I don't really go to either extreme. Of course, if the author is alive, and even if they're not alive, I try and find people that knew them or worked with them, or people that have worked on their work, because it's a great responsibility. You have this ethical burden to be, projecting their voice into a different language in a different context. So I want to make sure that I'm being respectful of the author's viewpoint. And so generally I see it as a plus, and try and work with the author. And they're usually a really great resource. But yeah, I think there is some dispute there. So translator as agent, very quickly, as most of you probably know, I mean, agents generally work with things that are going to be profitable, and literary translation is not so profitable. And so actually a lot of the times in my experience, it's basically the translator is the one knocking on the doors of publishers, small boutique publishing houses, and pitching our authors, as a, we're sort of taking over that moment. And that would usually be done by the agent who's working on behalf of the writer. And I want to have a shout out to Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. This is a private foundation in Bulgaria, founded by Elizabeth Kostova, the wonderful author of The Historian. She's an American, also went to Yale, also sang in the Yale Slavic Chorus, who then sold The Historian, her book sold something like 20 million copies. And she endowed a foundation in Bulgaria that is dedicated to helping raise the visibility of Bulgarian writing, bringing in creative writing training to Bulgaria, and also helping translators. And this to me was an incredible help. I mean, somebody who was bringing publishers, bringing agents, bringing journal editors to Bulgaria to introduce them to those of us who were starting to cut our teeth as professional literary translators. And they were extremely helpful in I would say, coaching us in how to be agents for the authors that we work with. So I just wanted to make sure to have a shout out for them. And excitingly now, the owner of one of the biggest publishing houses in Bulgaria, Jeanette 45, based in Plovdiv. They have now started a Sofia Literary Agency, is the name of it, and they just had a presence at Frankfurt. And so I think the Bulgarian industry itself is realizing that without agents, Bulgarian authors are at a pretty extreme disadvantage. And so we're really seeing Bulgarian agents trying to now sell works abroad and not just purchase works from abroad to be sold to Bulgarian publishers. So that's exciting. I think, maybe this dynamic will change, in a few different few different years, but I see still the translator is playing a role helping the agents at least. So I don't want to talk for too long, but as marketing, of course, we're all 2023, right? Everybody's got to market yourself. You got to do your social media, but this is really true in terms of translation. Even with living authors, I think now it's really interesting. As of 10 years ago, the translator's name wasn't even on the cover, and now thanks to #NameTheTranslator, and I think the younger generation being much more cosmopolitan and being interested in things that aren't, not having this prejudice that something that wasn't originally in English is somehow second class. Now a translator can really be a boon in terms of the marketing of a book. And oftentimes we take part in the book tours. So here I'm in New York with a couple of my authors and with Milena Deleva, who's the longtime head of the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. So it's Zakhari Karabashliev in the gray tie, and then Angel Igov in the blue scarf. And so we actually were working together to pitch the book, to do interviews, to do launch events. And especially when you're working with a deceased author, clearly they can't go on book tour. So here I am in Boston with Claire Massoud, little fangirl moment for me here. She's a wonderful author. And this was with Wolfond. And so basically the translator is the book tour and we are the voice, and it's wonderful, but it's also, I feel a great sense of responsibility. I have a new translation coming out in January, The Case of Gem by Vera Motovcheva, a wonderful historical novel about sort of the rise of the Ottoman Empire and how that affected Balkan and European history. And unfortunately, she is no longer with us. So I will be the book tour and be sort of helping with the marketing of that. So, and of course, cultural ambassadors. We like it or not, I thought, yeah, Kirill, you'll get a good laugh out of this and me in my native costume here. But none other than Paul Auster has dubbed us the shadow heroes of literature, the often forgotten instrument that make it possible for different cultures to talk to one another. So, this is a role that most of us, embrace, and I certainly love to embrace it. And it's nice that I think we're getting more visibility thanks to movements like #NameTheTranslator. So this year was incredible for Bulgarian literature on a personal level, but also I think on the more general level, because Georgi, I think, has finally broken the glass ceiling that was kind of keeping Bulgaria off the international literary scene. And in that same study that I quoted earlier, this translation and transition, they had said, this was published about, probably 10 years ago. They said, we don't have a cornerstone writer. We don't have a Nobel Prize winner. We don't have a name that says, hey, that's Bulgarian literature. Well, I would say I think we do now. And the good thing about this is it really opens the door and puts Bulgaria on the map as a place that has interesting voices, has creative, I would say out of the box type of writing. And it helps us escape from the stutter start syndrome. Like before, what I mean by that is, maybe once every 10 years, a Bulgarian book would get published on a more high profile press, like Georgi, his first book came out on Dalki. And then for 10 years, nobody would hear anything more about Bulgarian literature. And it was always like reinventing the wheel. It was always, you were always first. You were always sort of climbing the mountain, pushing the stone back up the hill. But now I think that we do have a point of reference with Georgi and Time Shelter, that it really will lift all boats. I mean, I just have sensed, talking to friends who were at Frankfurt this past month, saying there was a lot of excitement. People were coming to the Bulgarian pavilion, asking what's new, picking up our catalog that we do with the National Book Center. So I think, now that we do have a cornerstone writer, I'm hoping that a lot of what I talked about in this presentation will no longer be relevant. We can only hope, but I just wanted to then to end by sharing with you a passage that I just really love from Georgi's novel. And I think what resonated so much with the Booker jury, but I think audiences all over Europe, was that, as Georgi loves to say, a small language can talk about the big questions. You know, we're from the Balkans, but you don't have to write about violence. You don't have to write about bagpipes. You know, I mean, I love bagpipes, but you don't have to be exotic. You can write about the questions that are, you know, the deep philosophical questions of our time. And I think Georgi really tapped into that zeitgeist, into that sense in Europe of concern about populism, about nationalism, about how we understand and live our past in a way that went far beyond any one culture or one nation. And so I just wanted to share this passage that I just really love from Time Shelter, and then we can move into discussion. The less memory, the more past. As long as you remember, you hold at bay the times gone by. Like lighting a fire in the middle of a forest at night. Demons and wolves are crouching all around. The beasts of the past are tightening the circle, but they still don't dare step into it. The allegory is simple. As long as the flame of memory burns, you are the master. If it starts to die out, the howling grows louder and the beasts draw closer. The pack of the past. Shortly before the end, times get mixed up because the cages have been opened and everyone will creep out. If it weren't for the days, where will we live? A poet asked. What was his name again? But the days are done. The calendar has dismissed itself. There is only one day and one night, and they repeat eternally. I remember so as to keep the past in the past. So I think Georgi has shown that it is true that a small language can really talk about the big questions. So thank you all for your attention, and I hope this was somewhat interesting, and happy to talk about questions. And I already have some.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to unshare your screen so we can
Yes, absolutely.
maybe see the faces a
Okay.
little bit more?
Mm-hmm.
Let me start. I'm so glad that you ended with those quotes from Time Shelter. I just fairly recently read it cover to cover, and it's brilliant. And I read it in English, so I read your words. And so I mean, you have to be as brilliant a writer as him, I think, to put it into those words. I love that it's about time and the past, and as a historian, but also as someone who's getting older and whose own memories are coming and going, I guess you could say. I just found it haunting. Like, I sort of preoccupied with that book, I guess you could say, still, since I've read it.
Yeah,
But
no,
I was wondering, so I have a question. In translating it, sort of the negotiations you were talking about, the collaborations, you know, the kind of how heavy of a hand did you have? I mean, in the beginning, Bulgaria isn't really front and center in it, and later there's a lot about Bulgaria, and those parts I think would be legible to anyone, but of course when I'm reading them, I read them with my own knowledge of Bulgaria, so it's hard to know, like, okay, if it just a random American was reading these like words or these passages, what would they get out of it? So, and I'm sure it would still be legible to them, but I'm just wondering, like, how much, you know, how much, what kind of hand did you have in translation in that sense?
Yeah, no, Georgi and I have worked together for quite a while, I think more than 10 years. And so I had translated his previous novel and short stories and some plays. And so we kind of have and he's wonderful to work with, because he really has a sense of writing as a craft, and he's not, he doesn't feel threatened by, you know, suggestions, or he's very open to, I think he's a poet by training, and he loves to play with language. So for him, I think there's a certain joy in tweaking and, you know, experimenting, which is great for the translator. But yeah, the previous novel that we worked on, Physics of Sorrow, there's kind of a trend in American publishing not to use footnotes. And this idea that footnotes pull the reader out of the text, which is, you know, true to a certain extent. But when you're working with a novel, you know, like his work is so historically based, and it's so specific to Bulgarian culture at times, that it was really challenging. Okay, you can stealth gloss, but at a certain point, you know, you guys know what I mean, stealth, like try and slip in an explanation in the text to make it sound as if it's there in the original. But you know, sometimes it's, you know, it's very hard to make that sound natural, and you don't want to distract the reader by, you know, having a download, an info dump in the middle of the passage. And so we had really struggled with that. And so now with Time Shelter, we just kind of assumed that we couldn't use footnotes. And so we were sort of, tearing our hair out. How are we going to figure this out? And then the publisher, they had said, "Oh, we'll send you some of our books, just other books." And I looked, I'm like, "Hey, these books have footnotes." So I said, "Are we allowed?" And they said, "Of course." And so then Georgi and I sat down and we really thought together about, I think both of us agree that we don't want to pepper it and weight it down and distract the reader. But, so I think there's not even 10 footnotes in the entire book, but I think it was nice to have that as an option. And there were times when we're like, something is going to be a little bit lost in translation, but it's gained in terms of rhythm, in terms of pacing. I mean, it's always a balance, right? And so, but I felt like we really worked together with him. Did he feel comfortable about, the solution that I was suggesting? Or sometimes he would suggest, why don't we do this instead of that? And so we, it was very collaborative in that sense. And I'm, honored that he is open to that kind of collaboration very much. So.
Thank you very much, Angela. Well, first of all, I'm, my first comments will be, because I'm biased, I would like to thank you for doing God's work. And I'm so excited in a sense that it, as you mentioned, it happens so rarely. 10 years it's a long period for writers, but also academics and so on. And to convince, and to reinvent the wheel, please kind of accept my gratitude for a speaker of this small language, and I think I can speak on behalf of a large group of people, of bringing it to the attention, especially when you mentioned something, which I thought was really important. It is not all about, and here we have one of the most prominent historians, American historians of Bulgaria, sitting next to me, and it's not all about violence, and it's not all about, the kind of like the Orientalization, and it's not all about, the expected things. Oh, Bulgarian can think of this and that, as much as it is diminutive. So thank you for doing this. I'll start with several, very quick ones, so what is more difficult, poetry or prose to translate?
I personally, as a reader, read a lot more prose, and I feel more comfortable translating prose. There is a school of thought that says that only poets should translate poetry. I have translated some poetry. I usually like to work with a poet who's a native speaker just to get that sense of sounding. So sometimes I'll collaborate with fellow translators or with the author if they feel like they're confident enough with their English. But I personally feel more comfortable in prose. But I mean, Georgi's a poet, so his prose, there's so much rhythm. There's so much, he's playing with assonance. He's playing with sound. So it's, there's no escape from the poet, even in prose.
So before I pass, to Professor Siegel, I'm going to ask you two, again, very quick ones, and I'm not going to spare you the hard question. Georgi's novel, right, has gained such an attention at home, abroad, everywhere. But it also created, what I would call politicization, so how do you keep away from, all the things, because you see them, like online, we all see them, and not everything is very positive. How do you keep away from, being part of the conversation, which is purely political and nothing with the quality of the work?
I mean, I don't think necessarily Georgi is trying to be totally anti-political. He's very open about this book was inspired by Brexit and by Trump's election. He started writing his book in 2016. So although he doesn't, he's probably Bulgaria's most influential public intellectual. And so he does speak out. There was this awful incident. I don't know, Kiro, if you followed it in the Bulgarian media, about this young woman who was attacked by her boyfriend or pimp. It wasn't quite clear. And she was sliced up and kind of disfigured. And it was this awful, ugly thing. And he had all these like very patriotic tattoos. And Georgi, he doesn't usually weigh in on that sort of stuff, but he had a really amazing comment in Facebook that was, it's hard to translate, but basically like, almost like a poem commenting on this, that basically their patriotism is only skin deep, and that, because in Bulgarian, like, there's this freedom or death, and he's like, their freedom is death. And so he will weigh in on stuff like this. And I think, the Booker Prize generally, I think the Nobel Prize is much more political in terms of like the authors and the types of works that is picked, but I think we can't deny that probably played into them being interested in an Eastern European voice because of what's going on in Ukraine and the war there. And this book was written before the war started. He finished it in December of 2019. So it was very prescient in many unfortunate ways before the pandemic, before the war. But, I'm not sure I would necessarily, I don't think his idea is to completely not be part of a political conversation. Yeah.
Understood. Well, thank you for addressing this. And then I'll be quiet to give the floor to other people. But you mentioned something which is important, I think, a nuance which not a lot of people, probably pay close attention to as do people that are professionally engaged with the region, area studies, linguistics, history, and so on. And you mentioned political correctness in Christian themes on behalf of local authors that might not be palatable. I'll use the word that you use, for American or English-speaking audiences. So, how those conversations, occur? I'm just curious. Like, how, is it a hint or kind of like very directly, telling them, look, this might not be understood or even perceived the way you probably have it in mind, unless specifically you want to be offensive. So
yeah, no, I'm pretty open actually with authors because I think it's, being fair to them and to their point of view. I think if I work with an author and we have a relationship of trust, I can be pretty open and say, I'm not sure how this is going to be perceived, just so you know that the discourse in America tends to be this or that, or, and most people are appreciative of that. That doesn't always mean that they like what I'm telling them. And sometimes they decide I'm not the translator to work with them, and that's fine. If they don't feel like I'm 100% behind the work the way it's written, that's absolutely, within their purview to work with someone else. But sometimes they're, okay, I hadn't thought about that. And sometimes, when you don't just pitch a translation into the void, there is, you have a query, something like a query letter, you have something like a synopsis. And sometimes we can talk with them about how we want to discuss in the synopsis, positioning this such that it hopefully will be read more in the context in which it was written and not the context in which it's being received. But, that's always, and this is, my new translation, The Case of Gem, that's coming out. The author, Vera Mutavchieva, was exposed as a collaborator of the state socialist era state secret services like a year before she died. And she's a very well-known, very well-respected writer, but this is a part of her biography, and it made it possible for her to write what she wrote. And so, when I applied to the NEA, I did not hide this. I said, she is a problematic character, and I think this is something that we should talk about in terms of her legacy. So my approach is usually to try and, be frank about those sorts of things, even though, and then the author can decide how they would like to approach it or not. I think Stephen had some really good questions here that
Stephen?
Yes, sorry, I'm struggling with a cold a little bit and trying to make my way to the Polish Film Festival later. So I wanted to thank you for your comments and ask, if I may, two very small questions. So that since you mentioned Chad Post, I think of that big database that he keeps on languages, and we're constantly trying to make advocacy efforts, or at least in Slavic, for Ukrainian and Polish and Bulgarian, less commonly taught languages. And so I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts and ideas on advocacy, and like, not to demonize AI, because this is kind of the issue that so many of us face as humanistic scholars. Maybe you could talk a little bit about DeepL, its advantages and disadvantages. I kind of have this fantasy of Roman Jakobson coming back and offering a lecture on DeepL, and
that would be awesome.
Sort of rising from the dead and like pitching for money. So since you do this on an everyday basis, and
Mhm,
and I,
mhm.
as a big supporter of Ukrainian writers,
Mhm,
novelists,
mhm,
poets, I'm
mhm,
wondering
mhm,
what the future of this may hold.
mhm.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think, unfortunate, as tragic and horrible as Ukraine war has been, in one sense, at least it has redirected attention on Eastern Europe. And I think in terms of advocacy, given us a good platform to say, this is important that we understand how people in this region are thinking, how they're feeling, that these voices are not being swept under the rug. And I think that, gives us an opportunity to say, hey, we need to pay more attention to the way experience is being lived in this part of the world, because it's affecting absolutely all of us. And so I think, if there's anything positive that has come out of this whole tragic, awful situation, is that at least there's a refocus on Eastern Europe and the importance of understanding the cultural dynamics. So in that sense, it's but it but in terms of AI, I think I love your idea about a symposium about AI friendly, because I think most of us are just now, like with my colleagues here that do translation, and colleagues online with whom we have sort of conversations. I think we're all just now grappling with it, and I think you're absolutely right that it is better with some languages depending on what it has access to in terms of corpus. But I think the moment is that the human factor, okay, the AI has access to all these texts, but it hasn't lived the emotional experience. As Georgi likes to say, a machine hasn't had a childhood, so it doesn't have that understanding of the warmth of a human relationship, and it doesn't have the cultural context to know how to appropriately tweak a certain type of speech, for a certain type of audience. And so I think that's where we can have our value added, if we want to use a terrible business term, our added value as humanitarian scholars. But I would love to join that symposium. So let me know if and when it happens, and if and when you resurrect Roman Jakobsen, because I will be there in the front row. So.
Thank you. Thanks for your work.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen.
I can ask another question.
Oh, okay,
sorry. Did Vlad
Mary.
have one? Vlad, do you have a question? Oh, okay. Are you sure?
Not at this point, but
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying this, and it was a wonderful presentation. I'm really glad that Balkan Circle invited a translator. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Christian does, but let me quickly ask mine. Okay. So I loved your discussion of just even like, all of the different challenges that translators face. But there's one that you didn't mention, and it seems to me it must have come into place with Time Shelter and other work, and that is translating humor.
Yes.
Because what's funny to one culture, isn't always funny to another, or you know what I mean? Like, and also a lot of humor is just in the wording, So, and I found his book hilarious, but like in a very dry, satirical way, of course. And so I loved that about it, and found myself laughing, but also it's like dark, and it's like such a good, sort of digging into different emotions. So I'm just wondering about if you have anything to say about translation of humor.
Yeah, no, this is definitely difficult. It's funny because when we talk about the book, Georgi and I have done a lot of talks, and you talk about, it's about nationalism and about, the problem of, this using propaganda, using the past as a weapon of propaganda. It sounds really heavy, and I'm like, no, it's really funny. So, I think maybe it takes a little getting used to that sort of dark humor, but we did with him talk about if we needed to sharpen some of the jokes just to make sure that people would realize that there was a certain amount of facetiousness there. I think Georgi's humor is perhaps intellectual enough that there's usually a way to translate it. I don't know if maybe Kirill and Christian know the book Vozvishenia. There's another really amazing Bulgarian book that's basically kind of a parody of the whole Bulgarian kind of national revival of the 19th century. And the author writes in this speech that's reminiscent of that era. And he just And it's like, it's very funny, but if you haven't grown up since first grade in the pathos of this type of, it's just, there's no way. Actually, I would love to translate it, but I don't really see, I think, so much of the humor would be lost that, maybe some other translator will come along who can tackle that. But yeah, I think some types of humor, unfortunately, are very, very culturally specific. So we might need to have a smaller audience that will appreciate them.
That made me think of Baiganyu also, that had like 4 different translators, but it's still not widely read, I don't think, because people don't get it, or Bulgarian.
Yeah. I think it was definitely for a Bulgarian audience. He's playing with a lot of stereotypes about Bulgarians, and if you don't know those stereotypes, a lot of the humor is lost. Yeah.
But I mean, it took 4 translators working together on the project, not 4 separate translations. So that's crazy in and of itself. But Christian, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very, very interesting. That's far away from my area of expertise. Sorry, I'm not familiar with the literature and the cultural history. I'm historian, but with other direction. But I just want to know that actually your work is very, very important, because actually the first 2 books written in English, which were translated in Bulgarian during the Bulgarian revival period, where I think the Uncle Tom's Cabin and probably Poor Richard's Almanac were crucial for the changing of the thinking in the Bulgarian society during that period. I mean, in way of rationalization, in way of escaping from the religious point of view and thinking, and so on. So your work is really really important, very difficult, very, very difficult, because we are how to say, very typical focus on the local topics and so on and so on. And probably it's difficult for the foreign audience to understand our authors and so on. But I just want to ask you, who is actually your favorite Bulgarian author? And
am I being recorded? Because be offended.
And who is most popular in English-speaking world?
I mean, I think if I had to pick from the classical Bulgarian canon, if we go just among not contemporary Bulgarian writers, because I don't want to offend any of my friends, but I love Ivailo Petrov, the Wolf Hunt author. That is, I love that book. It's so, it's speaking of funny, speaking of, really, he talks about really important historical events, but through a completely personal lens. That would be, I'd say, one of the high points. But also the new book, The Case of Gem, which is another classic from the Bulgarian canon, written in 1968, but really interesting. I mean, it's basically about Mehmet the Conqueror's 2 sons that have an internecine war. The younger one loses and goes to Europe, but then he becomes a pawn with these European power games. And many people think it's actually a kind of a metaphor, analogy for the Cold War, because Vera Matuchieva's brother was a defector to France. And basically she's about this young man who flees, is exiled from his homeland, and becomes a pawn in political games that he doesn't really understand. And then there's this really interesting line where he and his Persian poet friend clearly have a homosexual relationship, which is very edgy for 1968 Bulgaria. So it's a really interesting book, So yes, it's very avant-garde in the structure too. It's basically a court of history. And they call The Case of Gem, with the CEM is the usually
Gem,
and it's basically that there's the reader, or is kind of put in the place of a judge, and the witnesses are called forward to give their testimony, but of course they're unreliable. Everybody's trying to, and you never hear from Gem. Actually, he's the one figure that doesn't talk to the court of history. So there's some really interesting things in the Bulgarian literary canon. In terms of contemporary Bulgarian authors, I mean, of course, Georgi is fantastic. But there's, really interesting up and coming writers. Ioana Elmi is a young Bulgarian woman who lives in the US. But she's going to have a book coming out probably next year. So yeah, there's some really interesting new voices. Yeah, it is on Amazon. So yeah, no, there's good stuff going on.
Thank you very much. Angela,
Thank you.
Thank you. Christian.
Благодаря. Christian, what I would like to ask is something that I guess I was tempted, like from a professional kind of like academic point, and maybe because all of us, either have gone through, with academic presses or are in the process of, negotiating and so on. I know my colleagues are smiling. Is part of our trade, but part of your trade is something which I've literally like first marked that during your presentation, the 0.3 problem, and specifically the buyer market for translation. And I would dare to think that this is not only a buyer market for translation, but for a larger chunk of literature, academic interests, and so on. So my question is, how do you navigate, like, because I saw the smiles, like in pictures in New York and so on, but I'm pretty sure behind closed doors, it might not be an easy path, to sell something, or to even ask people to, spare time to take a look at, specifically if it's not like on the map, specifically if it doesn't carry the label of, I don't know, and I should be careful, but Ivy League or like or literally hallmark of excellence that is well known, well accepted, so how do you break through on those conversations? All of us have our experience here, and I think we all have our opinions, but just please chime in on that if possible.
Yeah, no, I think there's no easy answer to that, but I think the work that you are doing in terms of being educators in the United States, working, in Eastern European studies and creating audiences for people like myself and my authors, really, I think the new generation of reader is generally more cosmopolitan, and we're really, I think, having things like Netflix, where it's become normal to watch things with subtitles, has really helped the mentality of just because something wasn't created originally in English doesn't mean that it's somehow lesser than. I think there's a generational shift, and I really appreciate the work that people such as yourselves are doing in the university. And I think further in the educational system, it would be great to see the literary canon expanded even on the level of high school or younger to include works in translation. I mean, when I was in high school, I think the Greek classics were about the only thing we read in translation. Otherwise it was, Dickens and Hawthorne, which isn't bad. But I think, thinking about the way we present the literary canon and seeing these voices as on par from an early age in the educational system, but that, that might be a ways away. In terms of, but I think the work of cultural advocacy and literary advocacy that most of us are doing now, and trying to, find new audiences, bring this, to new places, spread the word in different channels. That's what we have to do when we don't have institutions like, governmental or cultural institutions that can really help us do that.
Well, this was, you've touched it. I was dancing around it, and I did not want it, but you just mentioned it. Sort of a last, ask for a comment. Well, first of all, again, thank you for doing though, and you and the commission, I think, are doing God's work, because again, if you're a young writer, and you don't have a go-to, or you don't have the opportunity to show that actually, you're a cosmopolitan thinker, original writer, and so on, and it's been a problem for especially people that work with smaller languages, and we're actually blessed in our department to have Americans deeply engaged with Bulgaria, with Albania, ex-Yugoslavia, and it's the rich cultural history that and contemporary history that this is, and this is not self-advertisements like our daily kind of battles. So my question is, or rather, I'll start my last question to you in the following manner, because it takes an American sometimes, that lives for how long you've been in Bulgaria?
20 years. It's going to be 20 years next year. Yeah.
Continuously to be there and be a living bridge between this and and help so many Bulgarians that I know of, in their respective sort of pursuits to reach a wider audience, whether in academia or in literature. But do you feel any support specifically for the literary work? Because I think that this is probably the most important, one, because hard science obviously, translates elsewhere, like you have great Serbian, Ukrainian scholars, we have them here at our university as well, they literally, started producing high quality work and so on. But for literature, it takes, as you said, time, effort, and I would say investment. So where is the state in all of this? I'm sorry, I have to ask.
It's a complicated question. I mean, for many years, I think there was not much, shall we say, coherent and consistent policy to support literature and translation, and that has been changing in recent years, maybe. But the problem has been, as Kirill, I'm sure, knows, and Christian, the last 2 years, we've had 5 elections. Actually 6, because there was an election last weekend. There's one this weekend too. So there's been a lot of turbulence. And I think things were starting to improve, and then there were so many different governments in and out of, and it really, in a small country, who's in the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Education, pretty much directly affects how these programs are going to be supported. And so, unfortunately, I think that turbulence brought us back a little bit. And so it was sort of, this year was a bit of a scandal because, Georgi and I, we won this prize. Everybody, it was great. We came back to Bulgaria. People stopped me on the street and be like, hey, you're that translator. I was like, this is nice. Finally, a little celebrity here on the street. But, and Georgi signed books for like 5 hours, and there was this drone picture of like kilometer long lines. So this was like, people were very excited about this. And then the National Fund for Culture, it started its call for new translation projects. First, they reduced the budget from 300,000 leva to 75,000 leva, which is like 2 to 1, not even like $40,000, not even. And then they said that only languages from the European Union were able to apply. So that means no English because of Brexit, nothing from the former Yugoslavia, which is one of Bulgaria's most, I would say, interested partners. There's so many Serbian publishers, Macedonian publishers, that are interested in Bulgarian literature. And it was a huge brouhaha. And we ended up writing, many of us translators wrote kind of an angry letter to the National Cultural Fund, which unfortunately is kind of independent from the Ministry of Culture. So the minister and the team now, I think, is very sympathetic, and they hear what the issues are. It's just a matter of being in power long enough. And they said, well, this was already, kind of in the pipeline by the time we came into power. So I think, given the public outcry, we will hope to see something different next year. But it's tough. And I think, what's frustrating is that it's not reinventing the wheel. Like, I think every European country besides has a program that works very well. It's, we just need to use those models and make sure that those models are being presented to the people that have the decision-making power, because it is such a powerful tool for a country's, cultural diplomacy. It's much cheaper than many other ways of putting yourself out there, and making sure more Americans, as the head of the Fulbright, we would love to see more Americans coming here. So send us your students. So I think, we are definitely in dialogue with the ministries, both of education and culture, those of us in the translation world and the National Book Center. And I feel optimistic and positive that people mean well. It's just a matter of like getting the right information to the people who have the decision-making power.
Well, we just want to wrap it up, but thank you so much for this wonderful, thought-provoking presentation and conversation. And I'm so glad we could have you here today. And I hope everyone will go out and read Time Shelter immediately, but also all the other books that Angela has translated. So it's really exciting. And I hope we can get more Bulgarian literature out there and into the sort of global canon. So thank you for all your good work on that front.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely happy if you have students or anyone else that is interested in Bulgarian literature, be happy to chat with people in a different forum. So thank you so much for taking time out of your lunch to talk about Bulgarian literature. And thanks.
No, thank you very much.